Let's go to the 16th century now. It all starts kicking off here. The word race starts being used for a, quote, a group of people from common stock, like a family, a tribe, or perhaps at a long stretch, a small nation, end quote. At this time, so people started using the word race, but obviously not the same as it's used today. People would look at the different physical differences that people had around the world, and they would see those physical differences as changing and geographical. So people would think if you moved to a warmer climate, your skin would darken. And people would think that your identities would change depending on where you lived. So at this time, in the 16th century, geography is key, not so-called biology. And at this time, the British start trading with West Africa. They're trading all kinds of stuff, including gold. And in 1547, there's a trial in England. And at this time, in a court of law, a white peasant's testimony would not be accepted. So you see there's classism going on here. If you're a white peasant, and a peasant back then was higher than a slave, but lower than a free peasant. So if you had slave here, you would then have a peasant, and then you would have a free peasant higher than them. So a peasant, their word wouldn't be accepted in court. But at this trial, a black African man's testimony was accepted. This is really interesting because we see a hierarchy here, and notice that the black African, he's higher on the hierarchy in legal terms than a white peasant. And the only point I want to make from this is that people hadn't yet in Britain started to think that it should be the other way around. That thought wasn't even present, wasn't even lived out. There was a class system, and you could have a black man who's higher in the class system than a white man. So there's a hierarchy, but it's a different hierarchy to the hierarchy that turned up later. It's a bad hierarchy, but you could say it's not as warped and twisted as the hierarchy we end up with later. Either way, it's ignoring the fact that people are made in the image of God. So there should be a great leveler. And we know as well, don't we, that Jesus in his day at the resurrection revealed himself first to women, even though women's testimony wouldn't normally exist, which I think Jesus was doing a very deliberate thing there to communicate something about this. Now let's go to 1562 and talk about John Hawkins. This is tragic. This was the big game changer. He knew that there was a market for slaves because he saw Spain trading slaves. So what he did was he went on his boat with his crew into the ocean. He found a Portuguese slave ship and basically boarded them, stole their slaves, and then went to the Spanish colonies in his boat and sold those slaves. So he wasn't kidnapping the slaves from Africa, but he was kidnapping them from a boat. And this began the shift in Britain from trading gold to trading humans, because suddenly people realized you can make way more money trading humans. And Queen Elizabeth I, she funded Hawkins to go and do another journey like this. So she was impressed by it. And since her, up to the time of George III, every single British monarch supported the slave trade. The most powerful people in the country. So you've already just had the Pope support it, and now you have the monarchy in Britain supporting it, which means that Africans started to be seen as commodities rather than image bearers. And interestingly, in medieval thought, Africa was a land that had loads of resources that Europe would benefit from. But back then they were thinking in terms of gold, and when people were trading, they were trading with the Ashanti Kingdom to get gold and stuff. But now there's a shift. The resources we can get from Africa are people. What this meant as well, though, was that there were people who had slaves and people were traveling back to Britain, and sometimes people would have slaves with them. And the question was, hang on a minute, can we have slaves in Britain? Is it legal to have slavery in Britain? And there was a case called the Cartwright case, where it was said that England was too pure an air for slaves to breathe in. In other words, England is a good land. There's no place for slavery in England. At least I think that's what it means. So now begins this funny relationship that England has with slavery. This kind of, no, we don't do slavery. We only do slave trading. But it doesn't quite work out like that, as we'll see in the next century. Now, as we're getting near the end of the 1500s, you get this phrase that comes about called blue blood. We've all heard that, right? Where people say blue blood. I grew up as a kid using the term blue blood. As a kid, I even thought that royal people, if they bled, their blood would look blue. And this basically was a Spanish term that started to be used. And it's sangre azul. And it was used of white Christian nobles in contrast to Jews, Muslims, and West Africans. So part of it is a concept of different bloodlines. It's along the lines of nobility, so it's along the lines of class, but it's also along the lines of religion, because it's got Muslims and Jews, and it's also along the lines of what land you come from, because it's contrasted with West Africans. But the overriding concept is the idea of different bloodlines, which eventually becomes a huge principle. Right, now we talked about before the Mappus Mundi, and we talked about that book by what's his face, I can't remember the name of it, Mandeville's Travels. Well, another book comes out in 1598 by Richard Hakluyt. I can't remember how to pronounce his surname, so again, don't trust my pronunciations. But in this book, he talks about expeditions to Africa in the 16th century. And at one point, he describes John Locke bringing back to England 5 Africans who were there to train as translators. So this is back where people are thinking, it's good to trade with West Africa, to do good trading. We need translators. We'll bring back 5 African men who can, in London, study and learn the language well, and they will be helpful translators. And they're described as tall and strong men who were able to well agree with our meats and drinks. The cold and moist air doth somewhat offend them. Okay, so then he writes of Africans that generally they were promiscuous and against marriage. So this kind of follows on from Mandeville's Travels, the kind of sexualizing of Africans, that they're against marriage. So it's definitely problematic. But at this point, when he's writing about the mid-16th century, a lot of people were thinking in terms of trading with Africans, but not actually trading Africans themselves.